Welcome back to a special episode of Gross Domestic Problem. We have a problem.
$40 trillion.
The national debt just surpassed $40 trillion for the first time.
The U.S. national debt has surpassed a record $40 trillion today.
$40 trillion is one of those numbers where it feels like it stops behaving like money.
$1 jillion.
If you spent $1 every second, it would only take you 1.27 million years to spend $40 trillion. The United States took nearly 2 centuries to get to its first $1 trillion in debt. And it reached 39 trillion in March of this year. 5 months later, we're crossing 40 trillion. The gross debt has doubled in the last decade, and it's quadrupled in less than 20 years. And everybody is going to try to point out their political enemies and say it's their fault. It's their fault. But one thing I can tell you about 20 years is that we've had leadership, we've had trifectas, we've had Congress and the president from both parties having majorities and winning across that time. And basically everybody has massively screwed the pooch. And more importantly, the federal government is now adding $1 trillion to its debt faster than Apple TV adds Ted Lasso episodes. We are in trouble. And I'm glad that these folks have finally started to take notice. Today, I want to answer 4 questions for you. What exactly hit $40 trillion? What are we looking at? Why did it happen sooner than expected? What is driving it? And what does any of this mean if you have children, a mortgage, aging parents, 7 minutes a week to care about anything, and you are handling your own debt and issues? What in the world is this supposed to mean to you? So first, Treasury reported total outstanding federal debt at about $40 trillion yesterday. That is gross federal debt, which consists of about $32 trillion held by either the Federal Reserve or by private investors, and about $7.5 trillion or $7.8 trillion held inside the federal government by trust funds like the Social Security Trust Fund. That $40 trillion number is real. And some people are going to try to tell you that the 40 trillion isn't the thing that matters because only the government can't owe itself. I think you know better. The government can't cancel its promises without the value of promises becoming suspect, even if those promises are made to entities within the government from the government. Government promises and promissory status is the issue. So I think gross debt matters because of that. But in actual fact, yes, I think public debt is the part that has the biggest effect directly on your life, but both of them matter in different ways. So the actual public debt is $32 trillion or so. And even if you X out what's in the Federal Reserve, then it's something more like $27 trillion. And before you breathe a sigh of relief, just realize this. If you spent $1 every second of $27 trillion, it would still take you almost 1 million years to spend it. So it's not like this should cause anybody relief. This was something to worry about before we got to 40. And the worst part is the future of it, which is more bleak than anything that I have already said. Now, you may hear that $40 trillion works out to around $117,000. But I wouldn't expect a Venmo request from the Treasury Department telling you to pay your share. That's not how you pay your share. You do pay your share. And as a result, decline payment is not a recognized form of fiscal policy. What actually happens is the condition of the economy altogether in response to this. So here's the part that I think should really get your attention. In February of this year, the Congressional Budget Office, which is the nonpartisan group that reports to Congress on the cost of its legislation, the CBO reported that we were meant to finish this fiscal year, which ends at the end of September, roughly $39.5 trillion in debt. Instead, we crossed it yesterday with 6 weeks left to go in the fiscal year. The government didn't merely reach a larger number. It overshot CBO's number by $600 billion 6 weeks before the year is out. So we'll come back with an updated score when we get to the end of the year. But CBO has now raised its expected 2026 deficit, which is the difference each year between government income or revenue and government outflows or expenses, from 1.9 trillion to 2.1 trillion. We were already in the era of $2 trillion deficits, but now we can print it on hats. $2 trillion deficits. And that's not going to go down anytime soon if things stay as they are. Something happened this year that accelerated the clock, sure, but that's not the same thing as what built the clock. And it's not the same thing as what's going to drive it going forward. So why did the milestone arrive early? One thing is that the tariff forecast blew up. Now, you can argue, good people can disagree about the wisdom of using tariffs as government revenue, whatever. The point is, that was part of the government's revenue scheme for this year, and a lot of them blew up after the Supreme Court handed the Trump administration a major defeat on tariffs. But by far, the more important factors, especially for what's going forward, is that underlying programs, underlying expenditures of the government grew and continued to grow. Not just grow, but the rate of change is growing too. And then interest is now feeding on the debt in a way where we're beginning to borrow to pay interest on debt. And the thing about that is, it's not like a mortgage where if you buy a house at a certain point in time, then the debts having debt locked in at a certain rate from like anybody who bought a house in 2020 knows this, is different than having debt locked in at a higher rate. But the problem with the US government is that we never actually pay off any debt. We do what's called a rollover, where whenever a bond matures that we owe somebody what they gave us and what they lent us, we pay that usually by issuing a new bond to somebody else. And that's called a rollover. And so that means that US government debt is never that far from the current rate. So when rates go up, even if not all debt is at that rate, a lot of it will be. That rollover means the US government debt is even more susceptible to rate increases than like you are. It's different for the US government because that rollover means that all debt is eventually going to be subject to whatever the most current rate is. And that means that interest, it became a bigger problem this year than anybody expected, because we hit a 30-year Treasury rate this week that nobody has seen in 2 decades. I don't know if you remember what happened 20 years ago, but it was the financial crisis, so that's not good. CBO's February baseline had government spending at about 7.4 trillion and collecting 5.6 in this year. And that was already a deficit approaching 2 trillion before the tariffs, before the military costs of our ventures in Iran, and before other surprises like the rate hikes. But I think the thing to watch out for, and especially as we look at what's going forward, is that revenue was projected to be some like 17% of GDP. Spending was expected to be 25% or 24% of GDP, more or less, which is above its 50-year average, but it's in the ballpark. The thing that you need to think about is this: the part of the budget that you or I mostly know anything about, the part that politicians campaign on and vote on every year, that budget that we talk about, that we hear about whenever we have debt limit problems, that part of the budget is shrinking as a function of the whole. That part of the budget is getting smaller over time compared to the rest of the budget. And that's going to get worse. And what that means is that while we should audit, say, waste, fraud, and abuse in the government, we're not sitting on a $40 trillion waste, fraud, and abuse problem. We have actual structural budget problems that need to get sorted out. And those drivers are primarily what's called mandatory spending, which is the spending that government does on things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Those things are in the budget, but they never get voted on. And the demography of the country is shifting pretty substantially. When the Social Security Act was signed, for every beneficiary, there was something like 6 workers. Now it's 1 to 2. And the baby boomers, which are the largest generation of retirees in American history, are retiring at the rate of about 10,000 people per day. Now, good people can disagree about what we should do about that, and nobody, literally no one in American politics wants to see poor seniors starving. But the fact is, whatever you want to do about this, 10,000 seniors are retiring a day, and there are fewer workers as the population declines over time to support it. So we now have a structural problem. Add to that as we borrow to finance paying those obligations, interest grows in terms of like how much debt there is for there to be interest on, and in terms of the rate of interest. So you have the interest becoming, already interest is the second biggest line item on the government budget, and it's going to be the biggest in a couple of decades. And there will come a time in my lifetime where interest eats up 3/4 of all the tax revenue that even comes in. So the idea that basically you can just pin this on either one, like on some partisan intramural fight, this is Republicans' fault, this is Democrats' fault, is nonsense. No matter who's at fault and what's happened, and there's plenty of blame to go around, everybody has an obligation to make sure that the future works. And that kind of partisan infighting won't do anything. Those retirees are retiring. That's an objective fact. It costs that money to pay their benefits. We don't have the income forecast to make it work. That's an objective fact. You could tax every billionaire's wealth out of existence, and it wouldn't cover more than a couple years of any of that problem. That's an objective fact. And that's what we have to do something about. Because why this matters, for most people can't even comprehend $40 trillion, let alone understand why it matters to them. It doesn't mean that like we're inevitable, like countries don't go bankrupt in the same way that people do. What happens is countries' promises become unbelievable. And when the world stops believing your promises, a lot of terrible things happen. Like, for example, potentially you can't raise enough debt anymore. Or the interest rate goes so high that raising debt becomes like more expensive than it's worth. The US government is the biggest borrower. So when their borrowing screws up the dynamics of borrowing, you pay too. Your mortgage, if you own a home, if you're lucky enough to own a home, your mortgage is indexed to the 10-year Treasury. In other words, the rate the government gets plus a little bit more for risk premium, that's what you get. Why? Because the people who are lending money to you for a mortgage can put it in a 10-year Treasury and get risk-free returns at a certain rate. So if they're going to give it to you, they've got to adjust for the additional risk. So that 10-year Treasury note plus a little bit is what you pay in a mortgage and what I pay in a mortgage. And if you don't own a home, that's part of why it's hard to access the credit to buy houses at the current price. The second thing is that means just the same as mortgages are like that, business investment, which is a lot of times debt finance, suffers the same thing. So a growing national debt with no credible plan to deal with it starts to sink the ability of businesses to gather the capital to reinvest in their own growth. And whether you own a business or not, you are materially dependent on people who do. You're materially dependent on business growth as a whole. If the average market return goes negative, guess what? People lose jobs. Guess what? People lose paychecks. Guess what? Consumer spending plummets. That's the thing that the US debt can actually cause for you. And it is already causing it. That's the issue. It's not that it won't happen like this, or God willing, it won't. It will happen as the US government debt just increases in size and gradually shrinks the room. We call it the crowd out effect. If that happens, your ability, your future, your economic opportunity, that's what's getting crowded out. Now, there aren't any easy solutions to this, because even if objectively people think of Social Security as sort of a contract where they pay in and they get out what they paid, and that's it, that's not true. The average beneficiary on Social Security gets back something like 1.5 times what they put in. So at the very least, we're overpaying there, but the expectations game has been set that if you pay into Social Security, you will not starve in your old age. And most Americans including myself, want to see that promise kept. We want it to be the case that nobody starves in their old age who paid into this program and participated in this contract. But the room in which we can do that is getting smaller. The room in which we can honor the promises to the people who will desperately need it is getting smaller. And here's the thing. All of this is related to a very, very unhappy picture of what these entitlements are going to be. In 2032, the Social Security Trust Fund advisors have already let us know that in 2032, that trust fund, which is not really a trust fund, it's accounting inside the government balance sheet, but that accounting line is going to be at zero. The law requires that the Social Security payouts have to be adjusted so that they don't go over what the Social Security tax takes in. And so there's going to be an immediate one of two things, either an immediate 25%-ish cut on what's paid out in benefits, or an immediate need to raise the Social Security tax. And I think there's not going to be a way around needing to do some probably of both of those things. But there are right now ways to do it where the pain gets spread around to the people who can best bear it without destroying the entire productive engine of the economy as a whole. But that won't be true forever. We're dealing with a world in which the government's promises are becoming less reliable, less believable. And the problem is that over time, that doesn't just erode things that we desperately need to have. It erodes national capacity. It erodes our ability to re-up our infrastructure, which is crumbling. It erodes our ability to provide for our own defense, which, whatever you think about the current state of U.S. military defense, the fact is a country can't exist without defense. It erodes our ability to respond to. There are times when the economy requires system-wide, country-wide, massive common investment in order to realize an opportunity that provides for the prosperity of the future of the country. A really interesting example of this is the federal highways. In 1956, when that act was signed, the country was basically a bunch of little regions that had very little to do with each other. And the connecting of them, whatever you want to say about the downsides of it, and there were some, the connecting of the country via the federal highway system, it's responsible for depending on which economist you cite, between 7 and 20% of the country's GDP. You take that away, the country goes into poverty. That was a time when we had capacity to respond to a national opportunity. What will the next opportunity be? My guess is that highways weren't the last time that would ever need to happen. So if we're going to grow, what is that opportunity going to be? And what will it take for us to be able to respond to it? And this is why a $40 trillion debt to eat at our actual possibility of future prosperity. Your children, my children, their children. Like, we're in a place where 6 years from now, current seniors have reason to worry. Let alone like people who have not even started their careers yet. And I think that's why there's this general sense of malaise and anxiety about whether America will continue to be what it has been. And a lot of people would be fine if it wasn't. But I think that like anybody who's got children who they hope to have a better life than them desperately cares that the lanes of opportunity remain open and that they remain toll-free as much as possible. So here's what a serious answer to this question would look like. Because now that I've depressed you with the problem, I now owe you something of like what an answer would be. I think a credible answer would be bringing the deficit down to 3% of GDP over time. Right now, every year, that $2 trillion, that's about 6% of the US GDP. And it's unsustainable. It's unsustainable because the interest cost will eventually grow and force it to grow. But if the United States, as a beginning measure, sets a 3% deficit cap and gets serious about limiting spending so that it only grows by that amount compared to GDP, that would show to the bond market, to those investors who give the US $27 to $30 trillion in debt, that the US is serious about taking care of its fiscal responsibilities. And therefore, that would lower the market cost of debt, which would keep those interest rates lower for the government and for us. It would stop enacting major tax cuts without financing them. It would address Social Security and Medicare. There's a number of good ways for people to disagree about this, but it would start addressing those issues before their bankruptcies force abrupt, painful action. But when you buy in an emergency, the fact of emergency raises the cost. So what if we just were proactive? What if we looked at the nation's slowest tidal wave and said, look, this demographic wave is something we've seen coming for years. Why don't we get proactive about it while there's time to do something about it? A serious answer would put all revenue and all spending on the same congressional negotiating table. Nobody gets a sacred cow. Everything has to be talked about. Most Americans agree with this, but it's not the way it's done. A serious answer would be honest about the fact that some of the things the government invests in are actually the conditions of future prosperity. Again, highways, infrastructure, things like that really do provide for the general welfare. And it would stabilize debt relative to the economy to create long-term fiscal and budget headroom. Growth of the economy is indispensable to the country's future prosperity. But the idea that we can stabilize the debt without growth, or that we can grow without worrying about being proactively responsible in policy, both of those are fictions, and they're convenient for people who would rather that you just ignored this problem. But it is here, and it's been here. And the thing is, what the headline of today should show you is not that we have an issue, it's that the issue is getting worse, and it's speeding up the rate at which it's getting worse. And we can't afford to continue to ignore this. Thanks so much for joining on this special episode of Gross Domestic Problem. Thanks, as always, to our incredible sponsor, In the Black. Be sure to look at intheblack.org to see what they're doing about this issue and about bringing this issue to the attention of Washington, of governors and state legislators, and of people. Because my friends, one of the things that you can do best because the idea that Congress is going to about face after ignoring this issue forever, God willing, yes. But if not, you have to protect yourself. And so the first and most important thing that you can do in response to this information is to become financially aware yourself, to look at your own long-term financial plan and prepare for a world in which the economy's room to grow shrinks, and figure out how you can maximize your best chances of fiscal prosperity in a shrinking economy. In a space where even if the economy grows, so much of that growth is the government that the room for you is shrinking. And that doesn't mean there's no opportunity. It means that for people who become proactive about that, the opportunity is preserved the most that it can be. So get aware, have a financial planner, sit down and look at your income, your expenses, and look at the things that can be done, and get creative and scrappy about how you can grow that income, diminish those expenses, and provide a general future for yourself. And then secondly, become aware and active in this political world. Reach out to your representatives and say, look, $40 trillion, it's enough. What are you going to do about it? And if you're not going to do anything about it, then who should I talk to about replacing you? When you hear Congress or presidential candidates making promises, don't listen to the promise, what the bill will be. Because everyone wants a world in which the US government can aid the people in this country who desperately need it. And that means that the country has to be pretty ruthless about not aiding people who don't need it. But there's never been a federal dollar spent to whom the recipient was like, I guess I can do without that. So we have to get involved in the difficult phenomenon of political deliberation, ranking priorities, finding out what's most necessary, who's in most need, how can we help them? And then at some point saying to people, I think you have enough strength to do this on your own. And then we need to actually do that. The headline here is $40 trillion, but the iceberg beneath that headline is diminishing capacity and prosperity. It matters to you and to me. And the thing is, what we tell people on this show is that there's all these jump scares in the economy, right? Inflation, interest rates, housing, but the iceberg beneath, the boogeyman beneath all those, behind all those jump scares, the thing that's actually in the closet isn't inflation. The thing that's actually in the closet ready to ruin your night is not housing. It's the national debt. It's the thing behind all those scares. And so the $40 trillion headline, if it was half that, it would still be a problem because the future is still the future. But as it is, it's not only the number, it's the speed and the change. And that's getting worse. And it will continue to unless Americans demand better.